Well, if that's not a good welcome for you guys, I don't know what is, but
Thank you everybody so much for being here today. I know that we are so excited to have our 3 World War II veterans here today. So starting on this side, we have Fred Kramer. You can give a little wave. Fred Kramer just happens to be my grandfather, so a little partial. Sitting next to Fred, we have Jim Horning. Say hey. And then on the very end, we've got Richard Dodd Gambino, so give him a little bit. So I thought what I'd do with you guys today is give you a little introduction to each of the guys and tell you a little bit about how they got to be involved in the service, a little bit about their lives before, show you some great pictures. Hope you guys are okay with the ones I picked. I'm sure you will be. And then tell you some things that you can ask them specifically. So we're going to start first with Jim, right here. So Jim was born in 1923, which makes you just shy of 49, right? Yeah, just shy of 49. He was born at Harper Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. What did we just learn about that was pretty important for Detroit? Henry Ford, the automobile industry. Very good. Jim joined the Navy at 17. Raise your hand if you're 17. All right. So I want you to think about tomorrow, you finding out that the United States of America is going to war and you enlist. Okay, let's make this real. He became a corpsman, a medic, and then following that, he joined the Marines. He served overseas and fought at Guadalcanal, Guam, and Iwo Jima. And serving in the Navy, Petty Officer First Class. We've got some great pictures of Jim on our next slide. There we go. So here we have Jim and his wife on the left, married for 51 years, and I want you to make sure you ask them about how they got married today, because it's one of my favorite stories. And Jim, correct me if I'm wrong.
oh, excuse me, it's not picking up on video. And Jim, correct me if I'm wrong,
But that picture
is it Guadalcanal? And you are in the top right. Yep, far right standing up. So there's that handsome man right there. Wonderful. We can go to the next slide. So guys, things you can ask Jim about today is you can ask him how long it took him to actually get out to the Pacific. Because it was not a hop, skip, and a jump. It was not a Delta one-stop flight. It took a little bit longer. You can ask him about times that he spent training in the Pacific. You can ask him about fighting at any of those 3 locations. And I do want you to ask him about how he met his wife when they got married. All right, now we're going to move on to Doc on the end there. Doc was born in Martinsburg, West Virginia in 1924, and he was born at home, which is something that we don't really have very much of anymore today, something that I am very thankful for. Very thankful for hospitals, but that was very common for back then. Something I thought you would enjoy hearing is that he took a job in his teen years working for 10 cents an hour at an apple and peach orchard before the war. Does that sound good? Yeah. How many of you guys have jobs? How many of you make minimum wage? How many of you make more than minimum wage? Okay, so next time you complain about your paycheck, it's not the time. He tried to enlist 7 times before he was finally accepted into the Army. Anybody in here ever tried something and didn't work and so you gave up? Okay. Now try wanting to fight for and defend your country so passionately You get rejected 7 times, and you keep coming back. That's passion. Doc spent time overseas in France. He, luckily, was not in that first wave of D-Day, but he did go to Utah Beach, spent time in Normandy, Alsace-Lorraine, and the Rhineland, and served as part of Patton's 3rd Army. And he was an Army Staff Sergeant and the leader of Heavy Machine Gun Section. And I've got some pictures for you. I believe at this top left one you sent it home to your mom and she was worried that you were a prisoner of war because of how scary he looked. There's his newspaper article of when he was rejected 7 times but able to join the military. And there he is standing in front of a heavy piece of machinery, holding yet another heavy piece of machinery. And if you'll go to the next slide, Doc today brought his Bronze Star, which is 2 steps underneath the Congressional Medal of Honor, which you get for bravery, and that is the authentication for his Bronze Star. So after the presentation, if any of you would like to see it, I know a few of you have expressed interest in taking pictures with these fine gentlemen. He's welcome to allow you to see that. Make sure today you can ask Doc about what all he had to do to try to enlist. His father's reaction to Pearl Harbor, because his father was a veteran of World War I and suffered some pretty horrific things there. You can ask him about arriving at Utah Beach following the D-Day operation. You can ask him about the time that he had a German soldier point a gun at him and narrowly escaped death. I think it would be fun if you asked him about cooking potatoes in his helmet. Being seriously injured and trapped in a demolished building for days, what General Patton was like, and receiving his Bronze Star. And last but certainly not least, we've got Mr. Kramer here, Fred. Mr. Kramer was born in 1926 in Salina, Kansas at home. His father was an engineer on the Union Pacific Railroad. Remember we learned about that, the Transcontinental Railroad, all that good stuff. His family endured the Dust Bowl while living in Kansas, so that's definitely something you can ask about today that we learned about in class. He also joined the Air Force Reserves at 17 and went off to Texas and went to many other military bases at the time. Private first class in the Air Force, where he trained to be a bombardier navigator. So if any of you guys have seen the movie Unbroken or have read the book, that's what Louis was, okay? There, right there, that handsome man in the left corner is my grandfather, his World War II photograph. And there he is with one of his many talents playing the sousaphone, aka. And on our next slide, make sure that you ask him about his experiences and memories of the Dust Bowl, his multitude of odd jobs to help out his family while in high school and in college, how a tooth issue and a root canal issue saved him from going overseas to fight, and what life was like being on base in the United States with the war going on. That's certainly something that's interesting. But the good news is all 3 of these guys have some shared experiences. You can ask any of them how their families dealt with the Great Depression. You can ask any of them their memories of finding out about Pearl Harbor. My generation has very specific memories of finding out about 9/11. Their generation has very specific memories of finding out about Pearl Harbor. You can ask them about the military's pay, or lack thereof. How slow the mail was, and why. I don't know. But there's people Skyping in, so, yeah. About the food that they were served. This was disturbing for me to learn about. A and C rations. You can ask them about training at boot camp. You can ask them how they spent their downtime and holiday celebrations. I know in war films we see these big holiday celebrations for the troops where celebrities show up. Not so much. And you can ask them how long it took them to come home and how they were greeted at the end of the war. So let's give one more round of applause to our vets. And where would you guys like to start? All right, Keishawn. All right, who wants to take this one? What are K rations and C rations?
Look more
And here, let's make sure we've got the microphone real close to you.
Came in a little box about that size, covered with plastic, had a little can of mystery meat in it. We got 3 crackers, 4 cigarettes, and a pack of instant coffee and a pack of instant orange juice. That's it. We got that 3 times a day. We're lucky.
Sound better than your lunch today? And Jim's going to tell us about sea rations.
We have sea rations 3 times a day. Same stuff, 3 times a day, day in, day out, Saturdays, Sundays. It was hard to digest, but you had to eat. It disappeared, you know.
Did you guys have any fruits and vegetables or chocolate cake?
Actually, it took us 59 days to get to Guadalcanal. The ship we were on was so old, we weren't prepared, you know. The ship was so old that it wouldn't go any faster than 8 knots wide open. And when we were going that fast, you could get out walk fast, like the decks on the ship, you know, like this.
And there were 3,000 Marines on the ship that you were on that took 59 days to get out to Japan, right?
He wasn't very smart.
Well, we're glad you're here. And you had something with the water purification system on board, isn't that right?
The water was rationed. You got about a third of a cup of water, fresh water a day. And we had to take showers in salt water. And I don't know if you feel we're taking a saltwater shower and going out like that in the sun. It's awful.
That does sound pretty terrible.
Our teachers who are Skyping in across the county, gentlemen, are watching our visit today on their computers with their classes. So we want to make sure you can hear them. So make sure that the microphone is as close as it can possibly be when you're talking, if you don't mind. Who's got another question? I know we've got a bunch. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go work in the room. Okay.
Alright, we have like a story from like enlistment to like when they got shipped.
A story from enlistment to when they got shipped. So why don't you guys all talk about enlisting, and then when you were actually stationed at your base, shipped off to Japan, and shipped off to France, if you don't mind.
I was born, like I say, in West Bygone, Virginia, and in a small town, and I've never been more than 60 miles away from there. So they loaded us up in the bus and took us to Clarksburg, West Virginia, where they conducted us, and they sent us to Indianapolis, Indiana, Fort Benjamin, Harrison, where we got our clothes. Unfortunately, I only wore a size 7.5 shoe. Everybody else got shipped out. I had
Makes sense?
What about you, Fred?
Well, I'm one that dodged it all, really. When the war broke out, I was a senior in high school, and I had a nephew who was in the service. In the Air Corps, he said, "Why did you join the reserve?" Well, I joined the reserve, and they put out a call for all of the different ones on that particular date, and they didn't call me. Finally, I was called up, and I was supposed to have been a navigator bombardier. I was in the B-24 units, and two things scary about the B-24s. You went down below in the past the cockpit and on down in front of the airplane, and that's where the bombardier pilot, navigator was. That was scary. When you had to do anything to check to see if everything was working right up above you, the walkway was about this far, and you made able to step off right through the bottom of the window. And it just it worked where I was fortunate every place I went because I got with a big coochie, and all I did was fly the airplanes waiting to go overseas, but I never went. I was sure one of them. I volunteered in many things that just happened to work out where I didn't go. But the service was good for me in many ways. It sure teaches you a lot of discipline. And you aren't your own boss. You got to be careful what kind of packing your parachutes. And flying in that dude right in front, that was sat right there, the poor bombardier. You just wonder about how the German planes were coming in because you were exposed, totally. And we lost an awful lot of people. So that's my stuff. But I was there.
Well, when I first went into basic training, we didn't have guns. We had wooden guns. We trained for a long time with just wooden guns before we got real ones. So the United States wasn't prepared at all for that. When we landed in France, we had the old Sherman tanks, and the Tiger tanks had 88 millimeter cannons on them. Ours had 75s. Those Tiger tanks, we had our tanks, the shell would go in one side, rattle around and come out the other side. Our tanks, we had a Sherman, the only way you could stop them was maybe blow the track off, or get around behind them and blow a can of gasoline up into where the motor was. But the equipment we had, and the machine gun I had a squad of machine gun packs, a tripod carrier, a machine gun carrier, and 7 guys carried ammunition. The machine gun we had was one that was used back in the First World War. Water-cooled machine gun. Terrible piece of equipment. Much worse than what the Germans had. The Germans had a machine gun they could fire, and after you fire a weapon a certain amount of time, the rifle gets out and then the bullets go anywhere. But the Germans had one they could just throw a switch, pick up a new barrel, slap it in there. We had to take it out, drain the water out, make sure the packing was in order. They literally check the headspace, put it back in there, and then try to figure out where we get the water to put in there so it wouldn't burn up.
I got through food camp, the Marines come around and ask, "You want to come with the Marines?" They didn't have a medic. And I said, "What?" My buddy and I both said, "Yeah, we'll go." They made us go to the Marine boot camp. And I thought the Navy was bad, but the Marines, whew.
What was that like, Jim, the Marine boot camp?
Oh, they drive you to the ground. I mean, you stand over there and shout at you. And what they're trying to do is give orders and you accept. If you give them any boot, if you give them any trouble, bounce you. I mean, literally hit you.
What was boot camp like for you, Mr. Kramer?
Boot camp I remember one time we were snowed on Thursday, there was a cow tank over there, and we went on the straight top off and dragged out the cow. But there's one thing that's good about American ingenuity. By the end of the war, the B-24, the Liberator, we were making one of those bombers every single day, turning it out on the red road. That's right, yeah, but it was something else. I mean, they had it so mechanized by then. It's just, I flew a number of times in that B-24, but it was just some kind of a different experience. I go out and have to check if the gears are up and locked, and I walk on that little platform and say, thank you, God, for letting me go another day. But that's about it. The Americans were good with what they had at the end of the war.
When I went to the Marines, the corpsman, Navy corpsman, they liked to pick on us, and laugh. Until we went into battle.
We had to call them.
And then it was a different story. But now we had no trouble with Marines.
Well, I know we've got some more questions out there. Yes, sir.
I would like to hear the story about how Jim and his wife met.
I think that's a great idea. And do you want to try my mic, Jim? I think it works a little bit better.
Well, of course, we were young. We used to go to this bar. And,
They don't know what the bar is. That's okay. It's just an establishment where people talk. He wasn't there.
Anyway, we were ready the next day.
The next day, they were married. Met on a Monday, married on a Tuesday. Jim, was that a fairly common occurrence? They haven't had a chance to really. This is our introduction to World War II. So we haven't really talked about a lot of the battle specifics. We haven't really talked about the baby boom. I explained it very simply. People came home from the war, everybody's happy to see each other, we had a lot of babies. Was that a very common thing, people getting married that quickly following the end of the war?
Well, I don't know if it's uncommon, but yes, I think a lot of guys went away and their girlfriends, a lot of times they came back and their girlfriends were married already.
I know, that's... All right, great question. I'm glad you guys got to hear that story. Who else has a question for our veterans? Yes, sir.
What was it like to land on Utah Beach?
All right, Doc, that's for you. He wants to know, what was it like to land on Utah Beach?
Well, I got there a little bit later, it wasn't on D-Day or there was still battles going on. And one of the things I remember most of all, when we got up, we was going up the hill, and a 4x4 truck came back with it loaded with dead American soldiers. And there were two Germans on the back, and they were saying, kaput, kaput, with them dead. And that stuck with me for all the time. But I was with George Patton when we made the break out of the edge road, out of the beachhead, and we went down to Normandy, and with George Patton, we made 25 or 30 miles a day, and we did take a little bit of resistance. We cleared that out, and a little bit more, and we ended up at Brest and Lorient, which were submarine camps, and that was a large German garrison there, and it was our object to hold them in there until the fathers could take care of the submarine things, and eventually paid with before we went to France, and the officers told us, this is what you will be paid on from now on. Of course, we only got paid about every 4 or 5 weeks within that time. But we were now, in the old one, we captured the German supply train, and it had the pay manuals in there, and they had a lot of French francs in there. And we knew we were going to get paid with those, so the guys would light their cigars in the next car. Guess what? We got paid in the last time, next time. French francs. These weren't any good. But how many people have seen one of these? These are invasion ships that we got when we went into France.
And you can certainly come and take a look at those after the presentation. Doc was kind enough to bring those in.
Yeah, we didn't get paid very well. We couldn't spend it anyhow.
No duty-free stores. And what was the pay? How much a day? What was the pay? How much a day?
$21 a month.
21 a month.
$21 a month.
No income. Who's got another question? Yes, Shadiah, and then Spencer. I'm going to repeat that question for our people who are Skyping in. Shadiah is asking, since you all entered very young, 17 and 19, what were some of your biggest fears going into fight and serve? What were your fears at 17 and 19? What were you afraid of?
Japanese used to dig that big holes in the ground. And bottom of the holes, they take down those shoots and shove them, stick them in the ground, and then put camouflage over the top. Then they could get palm trees and stuff like that. You step on that and put out distance. So you had to be watching where you're walking and
And they, when we first broke out of the bridge, there was a lot of hedgerows, and they had the hedgerow booby trap quite often, and they had a lot of machine gun nests to get in there. And they also, most of the southern, the French knew around a lot of farms in there, and they had a lot of haystacks in there. And our column would be going through, and after some of us passed through, the Germans would have a machine gun nest in the haystack. So we started, wasn't very friendly to the French, but every haystack we passed by, we fired a couple 50 caliber incendiary rounds in the set on fire, make sure it wasn't in there. And the Germans had the 88, and that was one of the worst weapons they had. That thing was flat terrific. If anybody hunts, those artillery shells come up like this. The 88 went this way. You're banging. And a lot of times, if you happen to be in a wooded area, the Germans would target the tops of the trees so that the shells would explode in the tops of the trees so that the shrapnel would cover a much larger area. German tank, you could tell the German tanks when they came because they made a special noise because they didn't have the ball bearings that the Air Force had bombed their ball bearing plants, but they were still very good. Later on, later on in the war, we got tanks with 90 millimeter cannons on, which was a little bit better match for the German tanks.
Great question. Spencer, what's yours?
I'd like to know what it's like to serve a Virginia battle.
Doc, this one's also for you. What was it like to serve under General Patton?
Great man. I saw him, I never shook his hand, but I saw him several times. We captured a town about Avalanches in France, and the Germans were getting ready to make a counterattack. And we set our machine gun, there's a river there, and a bridge, and we set our machine gun on each side of the bridge waiting for the counterattack. And I looked up and there he goes, and he keeps standing up, headed towards the German line. I thought, man, that man's crazy. But he turned around and came back pretty quick.
Good idea. I've got a question for Mr. Kramer. How often did you hear the news being on a military base back home of things that were happening overseas?
Every day. We always had to announce it. Roosevelt was president at that time. He would come on and give his weekly statement. And we had plenty of information coming on. And it wasn't good. Not for the first few months.
I've got 2 hours and instructions about the only thing we have. Only information, that's all.
The Stars and Stripes, will you tell the kids about that?
But you didn't get that very often. And they, listen to people, they don't tell you anything, they tell you what to do, where you do it. That's it.
What were you going to say, Jim? That's okay. Jim, did you often hear information about what was going on in the Pacific? Or, I'm sorry, in Europe when you were in the Pacific?
Yeah, Denver is why they announced it over last year. When you was going on the war almost every day, they didn't try to hide anything.
All right, who else has a question?
So every 7 minutes, they go one way and then they turn and go the other way.
I can't imagine the guys in the army now, in Afghanistan, we are with cell phones and stuff like that. We had V-mail. And they censored it. I don't know how they censored it as a telephone call. But I know I had a lot of letters I wrote home that I got off my phone. It had my name on it and then down at the bottom, and they cut everything else out of it.
Well, we had one experience when we had Ernie Pyle, who was some kind of a well-known author, editor, whatever. And he came recuperating from an overseas service, stayed in our barracks for 7 days. And he told us stories every single one. That was really a goosebumps still go down when I think about that.
All righty, Sabrina, you had a question?
Yes, this is for Mr. Kramer. What was it like being in the Dust Bowl in Kansas?
So she wants to know what the Dust Bowl was like in Kansas.
Well, that's yours. That was back in 1932, 33, and 34. And we would be in grade school, and they would call us sirens, they'd sing out for siren. And that meant we had to go home because the dust was coming. And the dust would come in, and you couldn't see as far as you people were out here in front. And the next morning, we would have at least an 1/8 of an inch of dust in all of our windows and times. And of course, we had all the wildlife that died. I remember my dad was on the railroad, and after the war, he came back one day and said, "Guess what? I saw a deer this morning." And that was after the Dust Bowl. We started to get some rain, but the Dust Bowl was really, really bad for the poor people who were out of work, transits. We had somebody at our back door every single day wanting to work for cents.
My uncle owned a farm in Kentucky, and when that started, they started sending the cattle to the Midwest because we didn't have any problem like that. So he took, I think about 100 cows. And the government paid him $1 a head. Every month or so, I don't remember how that worked.
We had Kansas. We had wheat, and I know that one time we went out there and the dust storm came, and there was a granary there, and my mother, my dad, and I, and my brother stayed in that thing for 4 hours waiting for the dust storm. The dust storm was not pretty.
The dirty 30s, right? Good questions. Yes, sir.
Do you have any pronounced memories of FDR, presidency?
So he's curious, and I'm sure Scott.
I remember he had those dudes who says, I hate war. Everyone hates war. But we're going to war.
Anybody else with any pronounced memories of FDR? That's a great quote.
There was a lot of scuttlebutt going around.
Well, this is not an experience of war, but it's an experience of a good time. And we made a fight. We were going up to Seattle, and we had to stop in Mines Field in Los Angeles and spend a week there while they repaired the plane. And every single night, I went to Hollywood. All the actors would gather. Yeah, I went there every single night, got to meet probably every actor in Hollywood.
Who'd you get to meet that the kids might know?
I can't remember the names. I sat and talked to the guy that played Babe Ruth. They were fun. They were good guys. They couldn't go to the service, and they were doing their duty as the country. And that's the thing about everybody. I think everybody pitched into that thing like you would believe. We all did things.
All righty, I know we've got a question, Malik.
How did your families deal with the Great Depression?
He would like to know how each of your families dealt with the Great Depression.
We didn't have anything to eat, I'll tell you that. The information that was potatoes, we got potatoes.
That's the way we did too.
It was tough. Cost 10 cents to go to the movies, and a lot of times we didn't have 10 cents. A lot of times, all we had to eat was like bread with a little bit of gravy over top, coffee on top of it. My dad served in the First World War with gas. And in those days when you didn't, and he was in the hospital quite a bit, and when you didn't work, you didn't get paid. There was a lot of times we didn't have it. I remember going to school with shoes with cardboard stuff in the bottom to keep it wet out. They had holes in them. Our clothes had, elbows had patches on them. And it was tough.
The shoe store, they sold shoes for $1.79 a pair. And they last about a week. And the soles would come off because we had a little piece of leather and over that was cardboard.
But I think the hard times we had prepared us for the war. We weren't used to anything nice. So what we got 3 meals a day, our clothes, so that wasn't too bad. But I'd like to make a statement, war is hell. You can't imagine, you can see it in the movies, but unless you're there and you see a man get shot, cut in half with a machine gun fire, or burned alive in the tank, you can't imagine what happens to it. But it's hell, war is hell, no matter what goes on. But I'll tell you something else, losing one is a lot worse. Oh, God. I was in France after the war was over, and during the war, and you can't imagine how those people lived under the Germans. Just imagine what would after the war was over, we'd go through the people in there, if the women that collaborated with the German soldiers, they cut all their hair off. Of course, that wasn't as bad as killing them, but it marked them for the rest of their life. It's war, it's nasty. I can't emphasize that anymore. You can't realize exactly what it is to be walking. Think about walking around and the next time you put your foot down, you're going to lose both your legs. Or you hear a shell coming and you're going to lose both arms and your legs. You're under tension the whole time. It's just a brutal thing. It introduces men to their basic instinct, which is survival. And you do anything to survive. And sometimes it's not very pretty.
And we've got at least two interesting perspectives up here, because we've got Doc, who faced the Germans, and then we've got Jim, who faced the Japanese. So I'm sure they can both touch on that. Jim, do you want to talk about facing the Japanese?
They didn't have a chance.
They didn't have a chance.
Me and Jim took care of them.
Well, I know we've got some more questions out there. All right, Zach, do you? No, I made it up. Okay, you, sir, and then you, sir.
What was it like seeing the German tank or fighting against one?
So what was it like, seeing the German tanks, actually fighting against the German tanks? What was it like in the moment for you? Fighting against?
Well, toward the end we got the bazookas, which was a little bit better, but you had to get a little bit closer to it. But up until most of the time, until we got tank destroyers with heavier artillery on them, the only way we knock them out was run it behind them and throw a can of gasoline up into the motors and set them on fire. And you couldn't stop them if the Sherman didn't blow their treads off. They just kept coming.
Japs towards the end, had a little tank. Miniature, whatever, dangerous. Machine gun fire.
We had, when we first went into France, we had gas masks, but eventually we did away with those. We never had to contend with the mustard gas, the phosphine gas, that soldiers had to put up with in the First World War. Wars that, I don't know how the guys handle it today. You've got so many restrictions, you can't do this, you can't do that. When we were in there, we were in there to win, and whatever it took, we did it. A little bit of history. When we broke out of the Etter, I was in the 6th Armored Division, and there were other armored divisions there, and we had Germans trapped in what they call the Lazy Gap. And General Montgomery was supposed to close the door. Well, he fiddle-faddled around and said he didn't have enough soldiers to do it. And he didn't do the job he was supposed to do, and the Germans escaped through that. The whole German army was in France, and that continued the war for about 8 months more. If he'd have done his job, the war would have been over a lot quicker here.
Jim, would you talk a little bit about the jungle conditions?
Well, it's hard to explain, but they weren't civilized. The natives there were not civilized. Most of them had, I forget what they called it, but their legs were that big down at the ankles.
Elephantitis.
Yeah, elephantitis. And they were treated very badly by the Japanese. So they would tell us where they were after the initial hitting the beach. We had to dig them up, take them out of these caves, and they would tell us where they were. And then we would go up there and throw grenades and go in and drag them out.
And you had to look out for alligators and snakes and the malaria mosquitoes, right?
Malaria was very bad. I thought I had it. And when I went home, came home, I went to the doctor and he checked my blood and all. But they had another one that there was a dengue fever, it was called. And that was bad. He got the fever so bad he thought you were going out of it. Actually, you're in the Pacific, because of the heat in the Pacific, you would have a temperature of 107. And usually, if you're in the United States and you have it, you're dead. You're fried to rabies. Of course, a lot of them said my brains were fried, but
All righty, who's got a question? Yes, sir.
What was it like finding out about the December 7th attack in Pearl Harbor?
He wants to know what your memories are of finding out about Pearl Harbor. I'm sorry, he wanted to know what it was like when you found out about Pearl Harbor.
It was on a Sunday, and I was playing football. Just kids picked up in the neighborhood like we always did. And when we finished, I came home, and my dad was sitting in the chair next to the radio. We didn't have television in those days. And he was sitting there with his, bent over with his head in his hands, and I knew something bad had happened. And then he told me that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
I was over at my girlfriend's house, and her mother and father had gone out for a little while, and when he came back, they came in and said, "You better go home, there's a war on."
And they weren't just trying to get you to leave, they were being serious.
That wouldn't have won you married, but
What about you, Mr. Kramer? What was your memory of finding out about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I remember Pearl Harbor, plain as day, it just absolutely tore me up with all those people being trapped in it. And Debbie was flying at that time over there, the one that got me into service. But, you know, we had such a hatred for some of those people. The Germans, I remember we had a picture of the Nazis lining up, I think they were 1920 Jews, Jewish people, and going around and taking a pistol and shooting each one in the back of the head. God, how can we live with people like that? There's no way.
Well, these are great questions. Who has another question? Wayne?
I'd like to know about basically different places that are important.
Doc, he wants to know about when you survived the German soldier who pointed a gun at you.
oh, yeah, well, like I was buck sergeant, that's 3 stripes up down, and I'd gone out, and I was in headquarters company, which meant when we really wasn't fighting, we were protecting the headquarters company of the battalion. And I'd gone out at nighttime and relieved the people who was on guard, and I was putting the new ones in there, and I'd gone back, and I was laying down, getting ready to go to sleep, and I looked up, and there was a German soldier about as far as from here, with these Smizer machine gun pointed right at me. And that barrel of that gun looked like it was about that big around. And why he didn't shoot, I don't know. But one of the guys I'd relieved was late getting back, and he shot him. And that was the second time I come close to being killed.
We went to Pearl Harbor, going overseas after the Japs had bombed it. And it was pitiful to see all the ships that were sunk, our ships that were sunk, laying on the bottom. And all those men are entombed. They're still in their ship, those ships, to this day.
I think there were 5,000 and some of them were there.
There's a lot on that.
Just so you guys know, on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese did bomb Pearl Harbor, 8 nights of our Navy fleet was there. So, I mean, that really crippled our Navy. And what the gentlemen are speaking of today, there are still men in those boats underwater, the USS Etter specifically, that will stay there forever.
And every, what was it, December 7th? Every December 7th, they come around and still put wreaths on those ships.
Shania, you had a question, right? So, Doc, you said that was your second time that you escaped death. She wants to know about the first time.
Well, I guess that was the second time. First time was, if anybody's read the book Killing Patton, you know that they tried to take Fort Durand, which was around Metz, and we were working, my division was trying to help that. That was one of the first things, one of the only things that Patton couldn't take. So they called us back and was sending us to the Battle of the Bulge. And we was passing through this little town, and there was a house that had a bunch of German snipers in it. So they sent my squad in to try to clear them out. And while we was in there, a 240 millimeter shell hit the building, collapsed it on, and collapsed it on. I was in there for 3 days, and it wouldn't have been for a minute. Like Jim would come and get me out of there, I'd probably died in there. I was in a hospital in Nancy, France for 3 weeks. I couldn't hear. I had a terrible concussion. I couldn't walk. And when I got out of there, they didn't send me back to combat anymore. They put me back to doing some other type of thing. But if it wouldn't have been for him, I'd have laid in there and died.
So
You can imagine a 240 millimeter shell. It hit that building, collapsed, blew it into a million pieces. Why we didn't get killed right away, I don't know. The good Lord was looking out for us. There was 3 of us in there.
Thank goodness for medics, huh? Yes, ma'am. So Sydney wants to know, what were holidays like when you were in the service? Was Christmas and Hanukkah just another day?
Just another day.
Nothing happened, we didn't know what it
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, Doc, your mom sent you her Christmas spice cake or apple cake for Christmas one year, right?
Yeah.
And when did you actually get to eat it?
Easter. It was still, my mother always made applesauce cake, and she always, would send it to me, and of course, you know how it is, the mail and the army and everything, I didn't get it until Easter. And it was kind of crumbly up, but it was still pretty good.
We were too far away. It took the ship I went on, it was a President Tyler. It was one of the older ships in the fleet. And it took 59 days to get there. You thought, oh, what are we going to get to fight the Japs?
And it makes sense if you think about it, guys, because planes are not delivering mail during this time because of the Germany's Luftwaffe, and they don't want to get shot down. So we've got enough time for each gentleman to share just a parting message with the students, if you wouldn't mind, anything that they've asked about today. If you'd like, Doc, we can start with you and work our way down.
War is terrible, but it does have some humorous things to it. I didn't get many photographs taken while we were in the battle, but I had one taken, and I had the British people knitted a scarf, and I had one of those scarves for them, and I had my hair cut short, and I sent it home, and my mother opened up the letter and said to Dad, "Oh, look here, Richard's captured a German soldier and sent his picture home."
I don't think my parents never heard from him. It was so long, and they had a hard enough time fighting the war, so they never got paid. Of course, there was no, they didn't pay till we got home.
My mother, she didn't really know what the war was about. Dad knew because he was in the First World War, and they one night they were talking about one of the battles over there was in the wintertime. And it was, it was cold and they were telling about the battle and Mom turned to Dad and said, I hope Richard has a nice hotel room to sleep in tonight. And Dad said, well, he's probably sleeping on the ground, and she cried for 3 days.
Well, at least with your journey home, Jim, they made up for you because you were able to get home pretty quick, right? You got home, did the journey just take about a couple of weeks for you?
Still had to sue the government to get money time.
Yep, I don't blame you. And Mr. Kramer, the war ended in May of 1945 in Europe, and you got home in December, is that correct?
Then probably went to K-State and got commissioned as the
But then you immediately went into another very important service. You were the houseboy at the Kappa Kappa Gamma House, correct?
58 girls.
Well, everybody, here's what we've got. We've got about 8 minutes left. If you would like to come and see the Bronze Star that Doc earned for bravery, you can. Gentlemen,
Several of the kids have asked to take their pictures with you. Would you be okay with that? You can
come up and take a picture. I've got a couple of people I need to thank. Hang on one second for making today happen. Mark Tartaro for arranging our wonderful Skyping session for the county team. I think it worked out very well. We got the microphones working. I want to thank Coach Heron's kids for taping this so everybody can see.
I want to thank Trudy Delhay and her
Support at County. We need to thank everybody at Kell for letting today happen. I want to thank you guys for being such an amazing audience, but really,
I want to thank 3 gentlemen up
here for their amazing service, for their sacrifice.